Hello, BookTube. I have a tiny little mail haul for you, but I didn't want to do it by myself. Why? It doesn't have to be big. It doesn't have to be 20 books. It's a tiny little mail haul on a freezing cold pouring rain day here in Boston. But these things were undamaged. I have one periodical and one package, so we will see what we will see. The periodical is the New Yorker, with a cover to commemorate the coronation of King Charles III. There he is sitting on a throne looking very small. The cover is by Barry Blitt, and it's called Room at the Top. I'm not sure what it's supposed to say, other than that by the time the end of her reign, Queen Elizabeth II seemed to have filled that throne. She seemed a formidable figure, a big, full-sized figure, whereas Charles probably doesn't. A lot of his subjects probably remember Tampon Gate. They probably remember a lot of things about him of the type that they never learned about Elizabeth. I'm not sure otherwise. But this was a very, very interesting issue. It naturally had interesting cartoons, fun cartoons. It also had some a couple of the cartoons are a little pointed. One of them is this one. There are it looks like the Gorton's fishermen running from invading Vikings. I don't know why this person is dressed this way, but they're running from invading Vikings, and the caption couldn't help but cut me to the quick. It was called "Run! They're going to force us all to read Beowulf." That naturally got in amongst me because it implies that Beowulf is a torture to read, and I just did a month-long Beowulf BookTube event in which I couldn't even get my own co-hosts across the finish line. So maybe there's some truth to that cartoon. But as is often true with the New Yorker, there was also books coverage. Thomas Mallon reviews Camera Girl, that new book on young Jackie Bouvier that we saw on this channel and talked about it on this channel. I reviewed it and thought it was really quite good, really better than I had any right to expect. And there was also a long piece right after that, the other book thing here, by a very, very good critic. Thomas Mallon, I can usually take or leave as a critic. I think that I'm trying not to import here my unbelievably deep disappointment in his novels. He wrote a great book. He wrote a book called A Book of One's Own about journal keeping that is actually in this room. It's right over my shoulder there, right above the Needlepoint Frida. But he's done a series of historical novels about living history, Watergate, Johnson, George W. Bush, that are bewildering to me. They are just bewildering to me. And it's hard not to hold them against him as a writer. But even if I take those out of the equation, I get the strong impression from Thomas Mallon's book writings that he has reached a point in his life where he already knows what he thinks about literally everything, including a book he hasn't read, which is, if true, that is a really, really bad thing for a book reviewer to feel. If you sense that about yourself in a long, cold look in the mirror in the morning, or in that 15 minutes before you go to sleep at night, if you sense that about yourself, the first thing you should do is open your email and write to every commissioning editor that you deal with and say, I'm not going to take books for review anymore. I'm done. I can't move around my perceptions anymore. They're not fluid in any way. They're codified. They're tree bark. I can't do anything with them. And I'm okay with that because I'm perfect and I'm all-knowing. Or whatever the reason is. Or maybe I'm just too lazy to change them. But at least to recognize I can't do this anymore. There has to be an element of fluidity if you are going to be an effective critic. And by effective critic, I do not mean writing perceptive articles for Mount Helicon and a readership in 200 years. I mean writing for your readers today, writing for you. If you don't have that element of fluidity, if you don't retain your ability to be surprised, then you're useless to your readers as a book critic. Maybe he doesn't consider this to be book criticism. Certainly the stuff that appears in the New Yorker straddles the line between those Mount Helicon essays that no one ever asked me to write and book criticism, book reviewing. Maybe he doesn't see himself as such. But the other piece is by another great writer. I mean, Mallon can be really good. This is by David Immerwahr, and he reviews the 2 new books on Waco, which he describes offhandedly. This is This is very much along the New Yorker's line, where he is mainly wanting to write about the siege of the Branch Davidian compound 30 years ago in Waco, Texas. He's not really meaning to do a nuts and bolts review of either of the books under review. He's not really meaning to do that. He's using them as a springboard to talk about Waco. And since he's such an interesting writer, you don't mind. You absolutely don't mind. But when he mentions the two books, you at least have to mention the two books. He gets in what I don't think was intended as a shot, but it can't help but come across as one. He says, the ashes of Waco are still blowing around. This year has already seen the release of 2 television series and 2 substantial books, Jeff Gwynn's Waco and Kevin Cook's excellent Waco Rising. You see the difference there? One he's read and the other he hasn't. So he's calling Kevin Cook's book, Waco Rising, excellent. Now, in this case, he is correct. Of the 2 Waco books that came out on the 30th anniversary, Waco Rising is the one to read. But it makes it sound like Jeff Gwynn's book is not excellent, when it was really good. I'm just saying, if you have to choose one of the 2, you would choose Cook's before you would choose Gwynn's. Anyway, I'm sure that wasn't intentional. But then he goes on. Then Imawar goes on to talk about what happened in Waco 30 years ago. And I've seen our seditious ex-president, Donald Trump, had one of his Klan rallies in Waco, specifically to signify that a rising against the government is what he is going to do if he somehow gets into the office of president. He doesn't want to be president. He doesn't want votes. He doesn't care about democracy. Nevertheless, he's going through with some sort of charade because America as a country does not have a mechanism for him to seize power any other way. He knows on some lizard brain level, and certainly Stephen Miller, his id, knows that he has to get into power in the only way that anyone ever gets into power in the United States, except for Gerald Ford. He has to get into power through some sort of sham of electoral politics. He knows what he wants to do once he gets there, and that is to torch the whole thing and take control and never let it go. Pass it on to either Stephen Miller or his children, or both. But there isn't any real mechanism for him to do otherwise. So he has to go through the form of having his Klan rallies and doing town hall meetings with voters and whatnot. He's a gibbering lunatic. He's a racist, sexist, fascist, lying moron who led an armed insurrection to overthrow the government and execute his vice president. It's ridiculous that he has been incorporated just nonchalantly into the 2024 presidential election. He doesn't want to be president. Obviously, he doesn't want to be president. But when he had his Klan rally in Waco, I was really disappointed by the thumbnail characterizations of the Branch Davidian disaster in Waco that were spouted by, well-coiffed talking heads all across the news media in America. Of course, it doesn't take much to disappoint me by those well-coiffed heads. I have had a low opinion of American journalism since it rolled over on its belly and asked for belly rubs and treats from George W. Bush when he invaded 2 countries with no cause and no endgame, no exit strategy. When the American press did that, I sort of started looking at it askance and wondering if maybe the greatest generation of those hard-knuckled investigative reporters had in fact died. And there were none left, or only a few fugitive voices here on the peripheries, here and there, or at ProPublica or the Village Voice, whatnot. And if I had that impression of the American mainstream media before the Trump administration, well, it's permanently cemented in place now. It's unbelievable to me. Just unbelievable to me. The press, the Fourth Estate, is mentioned in the Constitution. It's the only employment that is. It's incredibly important to America. And this is its most important moment. This is the most important moment in American history. This is the Julius Caesar moment. This is the moment when America teeters on the brink of either staying a representative democracy with at least a nominal commitment to the rule of law and the upholding of virtue, no matter how many times the country fails at that, both internally and in external policies, or becomes an outright autocracy that no longer even has the lip service. That is just where the state becomes the possession of one person and that person's family. That's an incredibly pivotal moment, and what do we get in that moment? What do we get? Does Wolf Blitzer even know where he is? Why does he talk the way he does? Like a robot. Why does he do that? Am I supposed to be impressed that Anderson Cooper's writers have come up with a really good zinger quip? That they managed to give him a good zinger quip every night? Are zinger quips what we're in this for? Anyway. So I went in with my guard up. Daniel Immerwahr is usually really, really good, but I went in with my guard up here for how he was going to write about Waco before he talks about the broader issue of the simmering angers that he views Waco as epitomizing or foreshadowing or something like that. I don't agree with any of those characterizations. I've done a huge amount of reading about the siege at Waco, reading that may or may not be connected with one of the two books that I just mentioned. But here we get to part of Immerwahr's characterization of Waco. He mentions that the Branch Davidians had he calls it an arsenal. They had a giant collection of guns, hollowed out grenades, that sort of thing. They went to gun shows to make money. They were always in need of money. So they went to gun shows to make money. So that, of course, as one expert on the Branch Davidian disaster said, every gun dealer has an arsenal, has what you're calling an arsenal. We call it an inventory. But the Immerwahr mentions that and says, what's more, the Branch Davidians had an explanation for their arsenal, as the ATF knew. To make money, they sold weapons at gun shows, along with military rations, gas masks, ammo vests, and hunting jackets, onto which they sewed dummy grenades. Their wares included automatic weapons. These weren't illegal, but the ATF, in its search warrant petition, cited, quote, circumstantial evidence that the Branch Davidians were, quote, converting semi-automatic weapons to fully automatic weapons without having paid the proper fees. It's a couple of $100. That fee is a couple of $100. And the circumstantial evidence was the ear witness account of one neighbor who couldn't be 100% sure of what he had heard. That was all. It wasn't that at all. And if so, that's a reason for you to send one guy out to the compound, which had absolutely no record of violence whatsoever. Send one guy out to the compound, have him knock on the door. Is David Koresh here? Hi, Mr. Koresh. I think you haven't paid this fee. David Koresh would probably have paid it on the spot. He would certainly have apologized, invited the man in for ice cream or soup or whatever, and at least gone to town the next day to pay it off. It was an oversight. As Koresh himself said, this was a totally minor thing, an oversight. It did not warrant cattle cars full of armored and armed ATF agents. It did not warrant that at all. But anyway, Immerwahr goes on. It may be true that we stepped over the borderline of certain regulations, Koresh allowed. In truth, Koresh's foot was far over the line. No, it wasn't. That is just overheated language. It was not. He hadn't paid for that permit. That's all. For converting a gun. That's all. We now have copious evidence of his having sex with underage children, including congressional testimony from girl Koresh molested with her mother's acquiescence when she was 10. Yet the authorities struggled to show this at the time. Child Protective Services had visited Mount Carmel without finding cause for action. Nevertheless, the ATF got its warrant and fatefully decided on a, quote, dynamic entry. Rather than arresting Koresh outside Mount Carmel, as they could easily have done since Koresh came and went freely, or even announcing their approach, federal agents staged a raid. To prepare, they trained with Green Berets at a nearby military base. They arrived at Mount Carmel on February 28, 1993, 76 of them, with combat gear, submachine guns, sniper rifles, and concussion grenades. They also arrived with military helicopters with mounted guns to fire down on the compound. That was full of children. They would need it all. Whoever shot first, Mount Carmel became a battleground. One agent recalled that the gunfire was so clamorous he couldn't hear his own pistol. 4 ATF agents and 6 Branch Davidians died in this shootout, yet Koresh, shot twice, still lived, and Mount Carmel, riddled with bullet holes, remained unbreached. And it goes on from there in a substantially correct but very breathless tones. I realize that in 2023, it's not permissible anymore to suggest that perhaps a child witness was coached on the stand or that perhaps a child's memories were wrong. There's plenty of evidence one way or the other about whether or not David Koresh molested children, little girls, at Mount Carmel. There's plenty of evidence one way or another, and plenty of that evidence comes from one particular source, one particular church member who hated him. And I don't think that a lot of those so-called copious eyewitness accounts bear scrutiny. But fortunately, I don't have to weigh in on whether or not a little girl is lying on the stand, because whether or not they're true, nothing merited what Janet Reno's Justice Department did. Nothing merits rolling up trucks with armor and sniper rifles and helicopter airships with mounted guns onto a civilian compound full of women and children. Nothing warrants what was done. And it only got worse, of course, because, and those of us who were watching at the time, it was so obvious to tell what was going to happen. You don't bloody the nose of one federal agency without getting bigger federal agencies involved. You just don't do it. The minute ATF was repulsed, oh my God, the news footage, those of you who were not alive at the time, the news footage of just dozens of ATF officers walking up the road back from Mount Carmel, carrying wounded members, obviously dejected, dragging the butts of their rifles to the ground. These, the low ominous clouds overhead, everyone's still at Mount Carmel. They drove off the ATF with gunfire. And they didn't drive off one agent who drove up in a sedan. They drove off an armed attack with gunfire. They succeeded. Oh my God, when I was watching that footage, I was eating up everything I could about this story. I assumed, like everybody else did, that this meant that far more federal forces would show up at the doorstep of Mount Carmel, and that David Koresh would say, okay, well, I've got a compound full of women and children, I had better surrender. I assumed that he would do that. Maybe wait a day to make a statement to the press, maybe 2 days. Not forever, not just go on and on. When he started to send people out in dribs and drabs, I thought that would just go on until he was there alone. It didn't. That didn't happen. But I remember seeing those images and reading those accounts right away on the first day and thinking, no. This isn't what happens. If you send the ATF up the road with a bloodied nose, then the FBI or the CIA is going to show up. And you're gonna find out what the real fist of the government feels like, and that's what happened. And Imawar is really good. It's a good piece. I will clip it out and put it in my copy of Waco Rising, definitely. But the question here, people are on two sides of the larger question of the Waco massacre. On the one side of that larger question is, did this represent the boiling up of a nascent American militia movement that would lead to Timothy McVeigh bombing the Murtaugh building? It would lead to all of these homegrown militias, all of whom worship at the altar of Waco and Ruby Ridge. Was that the significance of the Waco standoff? Or was the significance that if you do anything, if you step out of line, the government will wipe you out? And obviously those two larger, looking for what this all means with a capital M, those two larger interpretations are not incompatible. They can both work together. But I got to tell you, at the time, the second one seemed far, far more likely as an interpretation. The Branch Davidians had not bothered anyone. It was perfectly legal to do what they were doing with their arms. And again, I don't want to get into trouble, but I think there is at least a hint of uncertainty as to what David Koresh was doing on that property to the young girls on that property, 12 years old, 13 years old. The sheriff in Waco said, well, if he's got their parents' permission, that's legal in Texas. I might not like that. I don't like that. If it was my own daughter, I'd shoot him in the head. But it is legal if his parents are right there and saying, go ahead. We say not. Of course, in hostage testimony, we have huge amounts of records of the negotiation team talking with people inside the compound, especially David Koresh's right-hand man, who admitted that that probably happened, but her parents knew about it. And the negotiators were working from a playbook. They were told, do not abrade these people, do not argue with them. We want to establish a rapport. We want to be seen as friends so that when we make them offers, they will think they're coming from a friendly source. So don't argue. Don't pick fights. Especially don't get outraged or offended. And even so, the negotiator on the phone said, oh, come on. You know that's wrong. It doesn't matter if her parents knew about it or not. All right, okay. That might have happened. But I don't think, this is touchy territory, but I don't think, to put it mildly, I don't think that justifies a federal response that was guaranteed to kill all those children anyway. I would rather a federal response that had, if those little children were molested by David Koresh, I would rather a federal response that had them dealing with that in therapy into their 60s, as opposed to dying horribly in an underground bunker by fire, by flame, and by skin-burning gas. In other words, not quickly. They knew what was coming. They were terrified for the last 2 hours of their lives, sometimes longer than that. Some of them probably lived a lot longer than that. Absolutely terrified and then dead. At the time, for me anyway, the second interpretation was very much the one that stands out. That if you're a little odd, the government's going to roll up to your front door and wipe you out. And they're not going to care how many innocents are involved. But I urge you to read at least Waco Rising. Your library, if you're in America, your library will probably have copies of both books, Gwyn's and Cook's. You should, if you're interested in the subject, read both of them. They're both pretty good. They're both very, very good. I distrust this urge to find a deeper meaning with a capital M in Waco. But if you're going to fall on one side or the other of that. But anyway, then we have that was a long, long digression. It was a good issue of the New Yorker, in other words, except for the horror of Beowulf. The monks at Lindisfarne. That's what they're really worried about. They're going to make us read Beowulf. But anyway, let's move on to the one package here. And then we'll be done with the mail on this freezing cold, pouring rain day. Oh, great. Oh, fantastic. Okay. This is the finished copy. This is a May release, I believe. Yeah, this is a May release of Fractal Noise by Christopher Paolini. His follow-up to Sleep in the Sea of Stars. One of you pointed out, asked when I mentioned this last time, am I going to mention the AI-generated cover? If this cover really is AI-generated, I think we can all agree it's really good. I think science fiction and fantasy covers are especially vulnerable or lucky, depending on where you stand on the subject, to AI-generated covers. I can picture this being a lot worse in the hands of a human. Well, actually, will this tell me? Will the finished copy tell me that the cover was made? The jacket art is by Shutterstock. No mention made of an AI program. But who knows? Oh, wow. Very nice. Look at the end papers on this. The finished copy did not have those. So let's read a little bit about this. We've already seen this on this channel and talked about it a couple of times. This is really good. Let's see. This has blurbs on the back from... Oh, these are all blurbs for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which I really liked. I wonder if there are more... Oh, here's the Kirkus review. I wonder if there are more blurbs in here. No? But no blurbs for this book yet, although this has been favorably reviewed. Okay, yeah, all right. There are reviews for Fractal Noise on the back. Kirkus Reviews praised it. Library Journal praised it. Booklist praised it. No one in time for this publicity sheet pulled out any quotes from Analog. The reviewer in Analog gave it unbelievably high praise. Said that this is the birth of a science fiction master. Maybe they don't know about that, or it was too late to get on the page. Let's see here. This book is set 23 years before the events into Sleep in a Sea of Stars. It's a fantastic entry point into the fractal verse, but will also delight existing fans. Where the earlier book was a love letter to the sprawling science fiction epics Paolini read growing up, Fractal Noise is a tense thriller about first contact, as terrifying as it is exhilarating. On July 25th, 2234, the crew of the Adamura discovers the anomaly with a capital A. On a seemingly uninhabited planet, Talos 7, a circular pit 50 kilometers wide, its curves not of nature but of design. Now a small team must land and journey on foot across the surface to learn who built the hole and why. But they all carry the burdens of lives carved out in disparate colonies in the cold cruel of space. For some, the mission is the dream of a lifetime. For others, a risk not worth taking. And for one, a desperate attempt to find meaning in an uncaring universe. And I want to stress here for this is going on long for only one book. It was because of Waco. I could talk for 2 hours about the Waco siege. I want to stress here. I'm very happy to see the finished copy has one element missing from it that was on the advanced copy. The advanced copy had a line up here saying a fractal verse novel, and I disagreed with that completely, because that makes you feel like you're coming in late to a story. That pub sheet is correct. You can pick this up without knowing anything about the earlier book. And you should. You science fiction fans out there will really enjoy it. But I would argue that the way it is constructed, the particular gimmick that drives this whole story, I would argue that even if you're not a science fiction fan, you would really enjoy this. Glad to have it. Glad to have a finished copy. That's wonderful. So that is, believe it or not, the mail. Geez, that took long enough, didn't it? So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.